Driving through the suburbs of St. Louis, it would be easy to think that this is an area that has lost touch with its cultural heritage. Any links to the past seem to have been bulldozed over, and in their place, freeways and strip malls have been laid down. As the urban sprawl from St. Louis continues to expand, our past is sacrificed for the sake of our convenience.
I think there's probably only about a half a dozen communities in the St. Louis region that actually has historical buildings and like we have. So I think it's a great asset for our community.
The surrounding areas of St. Louis are in danger of losing contact altogether with the thrilling history of the farmland and westward expansion that give this area a sense of identity.
It had been a farming community for many, many years, and that was changing.
Those who remember St. Louis in a simpler time are quickly fading and are being replaced by a new generation that has no recollection of sprawling farmland and rolling meadows, only concrete and steel.
Well, I think that historic preservation is important for two reasons. One is that it tells us about our past, and the other reason is that historic buildings are physical resources that it's wasteful to destroy.
But there is one landmark, tucked away in Millennium Park in the leafy suburb of Creve Coeur, that will help preserve the memory of a time when we didn't have cars, electricity, even running water, and also will help remind us of how our ancestors made it over to this new land in search of a better life.
Initially, it wasn't unusual that it was an older house, but as development has happened in this area, it's one of the survivors, one of the remaining houses that are left.
Rise and sing with you to your peaceful harmony.
The Tappmeyer house was built by the Tappmeyer family, and they preserved it and they donated some money to the cause of restoring it. They're trying to put it back as it was in the day when it was built.
Frederick William Tappmeyer was a German man who had moved over from Europe with his sister Adelia Tappmeyer. It is believed the reason the Tappmeyers moved from Europe was the European potato crop failure of the 1800s. This failure caused a flood of Europeans to head west to escape the strife of an era that became known as the Hungry Forties, in search of a more prosperous life on the continent of America. It was from Prussia, a German state, that the Tappmeyers fled.
It's a reminder of how prosperous the German immigrants to St. Louis had become by the 1880s. The Tappmeyers had started out in just a few rooms in the corner of their barn when they first moved here, and just within a few years they had enough resources to build this lovely house.
It was more than 130 years ago, in 1880, when a German immigrant named Henry Shreve signed an agreement with Fritz Tappmeyer stating,
"I, Henry Shreve, do all the carpenter work on the house and stable, to be builded on Olive Street Road, all number 1 work for Mr. Fritz Tappmeyer. Mr. Tappmeyer has to board the carpenter man when the working on the house for the sum of $260.
During the time the house was being built, the Tappmeyer family lived in the granary located at the back of the house, hosting the immigrant worker, Henry Shreve. It took 4 years to finish, with the work finally reaching completion in 1884. For more than 100 years, lasting 4 generations, the Tappmeyers and their descendants lived in the house.
The Tappmeyers who lived in this house, who built this house in 1880 until when my grandmother left this house in 1988, for this 108 years they were farmers. They had this original home place, which was consisted of just slightly over 30 acres, and over time they acquired other farm ground.
Creve Coeur was strictly a farming community, and so that's our heritage, is farming. And so it's a sample of the way people lived back then as farmers.
Frederick Tappmeyer, or Fritz as he was known, left the house and 4 other sections of land to his son William, who died in 1963. The land was eventually divided up between his children, resulting in Mr. and Mrs. William Tappmeyer Jr. owning and living in the homestead.
My grandmother was the last person to live here. My grandfather died in this house.
The proud farmer died having spent his entire 78 years on the farm. He spent the last few decades of his life turning down offers from rich developers from out-of-state companies. Some, however, realized the importance of the house and understood that such a significant building could not be destroyed and replaced by corporate America.
The Tappmeyer House was identified by our County Historic Buildings Commission back in 1970 as one of the most historic buildings in St. Louis County. That was long before I came to work here. And they recognized it because it was such a beautifully designed example of a farmhouse. Most farmhouses from the 1880s were of no architectural merit at all, but this is beautifully proportioned and designed and well constructed. So it must have stood out even in its own day, I think.
It's a great part of Creve Coeur history, and it's a wonderful place to show off to future generations what the original occupants of Creve Coeur were like and how they lived.
The unique appeal of the house was not seen by everyone, however.
The house was in danger of being destroyed several times. It was on the cusp of the powers that be authorizing its destruction. My grandmother and grandfather knew that it took a lot of work to maintain this house, and there had been for many years developers who had been pestering them and knocking on their door. I had approached my grandparents about trying to keep the house where it was at and the condition it was in, because the family had, although they had painted it and had updated it for their conveniences in terms of putting in a bathroom, nothing major had ever been done to this house since it was built in 1880 and the addition was built on in about 1884. But when people thought that that might be disappearing, then they were very upset. They didn't want to see that go. So ultimately, the family sold the property in 1988 to a developer with a restrictive indenture that the developer was to restore the house as a house museum. And that was one way that the family thought that they could maintain the importance and significance of the farmer in this community.
It's a piece of Creve Coeur history, and it's been a long, hard struggle. The house, as you know, originally sat on Olive Street Road, and because the property was sold, we moved it.
The city of Creve Coeur recognized how important this was to the Creve Coeur's community cultural heritage, and so the mayor of Creve Coeur and the city council asked for a study to be done by a well-known architect at the time, whose name was Gerhard Kramer. And Gerhard Kramer wrote a report giving an assessment of the house that it was so important to the architectural heritage of the area that the house needed to be retained.
Actually, they were going to tear it down, so we actually had to move it to a new location, and the park was available, so we moved it to the park.
Ultimately, after many years of roadblocks, the city once again said that they needed to make a change, and they suggested that the house needed to be moved to Millennium Park, which is a park that the city owned. And so that's when we undertook the big move in 2003.
We had to find a place that was fairly close to the original site, because the farther you had to move it, the more it cost, and we had limited funds at that time. And this park was just kind of ideal to move it to, because it only was about a half-mile distance that we had to move it. And it fit very well in the park, and it's working out very nicely. When
we learned that the house did need to be moved, this was the best location and the most accessible to be able to put the house down. Now, it makes it sound like that they did this overnight, but instead it took many, many weeks. And when it came time to actually move the house down Olive and down Mason Road, there was a whole group of people that had been meeting for several weeks, or actually several months.
But then the weather turned bad that particular day, snow and ice, and as a result, they couldn't move the house. It was just too dangerous.
The house had been moved out onto steel plates, and we had a terrific ice storm, and it froze those huge tires onto these steel plates. And these steel plates were about 1 inch thick. And I can recall the Matico brothers and their helpers using blowtorches, trying to heat up the steel plates enough at the location where the tires were so that they could rock the house and pull it forward to get it up on the olive. We had all these utility vehicles with their lights flashing. It's 5:30 in the morning, and there's a lot of adrenaline pumping that people wanted to see that moved because it was going to be costly if it didn't get moved. But fortunately, someone realized that the potential cost was much greater than just dollars if we moved it and anything went bad.
We had Emory and UE come, and they have to take down all of the wires. And then it started sleeting and snowing, and we canceled it. But they still charged us because they had to put all the wires back up. And then the following week, we did it all over again, and we were determined the following week we were going to move.
Finally, after years of protest and fundraising, the house had a new home and the men who were capable of moving it.
Well, the process of moving the house was a learning experience in itself.
Oh yes, it was very exciting. It was on a Sunday morning, very early in the morning. It was very overcast and cold.
It was a freezing cold day, and it was sleeting and icy, and they moved the house on huge rollers.
And of course, the city had crews out there to move the traffic. The electrical company had crews which had to disconnect and then reconnect the wires as they crossed over Olive. And so there was quite a large group of people there, even aside from just the gawkers like myself.
But we had a huge crowd of people just lined up on the street down Mason as they brought the house over. And anybody who was around will tell you what a fabulous move that was.
And there was so many people from the public, even though again it was a freezing cold day, that how often do you see a house that's been considered a landmark moving down a major thoroughfare in St. Louis County? So it was an adventure. It was very interesting.
123 years after the house was built, 15 years after it was last lived in, the house had a new home, free from the threat of demolition.
Well, I think when you can have a complete community where you can have residents, business, and historical buildings and community buildings, I think that makes you a complete community, and people like to live in areas that provide everything for their families.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why we're concerned with historic preservation, especially in a community that has 91 municipalities. It's important for each one of those municipalities to have a distinct identity, and their historic character is what creates those distinct identities. Otherwise, it's just a row of franchises that you can see in every community across the country, the same brands, the same even designs of buildings.
I think it's so important that this house is preserved because it's an opportunity to have a learning lab. And by that I mean you can have hands-on experiences in here, in this house, either in it, sitting outside of it, that makes things come to life. And that you can understand our history, our past, so that we have an opportunity to move forward.
By sustaining the house, it has become an anchor in time. As the tide of commercialism continues to consume postmodern America, the Tappmeyer House will be able to bring people back to remind us of our cultural heritage.